The frost-layered grass beside the narrow drainage culvert held an object no one expected that morning. A half-buried rectangle of warped cardboard that investigators lifted with slow, deliberate caution, realizing within seconds that the missing fragment of a family album had waited through years of winters for someone to finally notice its quiet insistence on being found. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The winter of 1977 had come early to Denver, pushing cold air through the Front Range and leaving neighborhoods wrapped in their usual December routines of half-lit porches, bundled shoppers, and the faint scent of pine drifting from Christmas tree lots. Families prepared for the upcoming holidays the way they always had, cataloging memories through photographs, gatherings, and the hopeful expectation that another year was reaching its safe and familiar end. But for one family on the southeast edge of the city, that comfort had fractured the night their 22-year-old daughter, Ellen Kramer, failed to return home after a shift at the small camera shop where she worked. It was supposed to be a straightforward evening during the busiest photography season of the year, when customers rushed to finish prints before Christmas Eve. Instead, it became the start of a disappearance that unsettled an entire community, already bracing against the dark quiet of a Colorado winter. The missing person report was filed before sunrise on December 14. Detectives noted the family's precision in timelines, reflecting a household accustomed to recording moments carefully, a habit shaped by Ellen's interest in photography. She was known for organizing albums by season, by holiday, by year, each one a meticulously preserved record of the life unfolding around her. And yet one particular photograph, taken during Thanksgiving that year, had been curiously absent from its expected place. No significance was attached to the omission at first. Families misplace photos. Prints get stuck between album pages or left inside envelopes. But as investigators reconstructed her final movements, that missing image began to cast a subtle but undeniable gravity over the case. Denver police began standard procedures: interviews with coworkers, a search of the shop's backroom, a review of receipts and customer logs from that night. Snow was already falling by the time officers retraced the path she normally walked to reach the bus stop. Street lamps reflected dimly off the icy pavement, the cold mooting sound and deepening the sense that anything could vanish quickly beneath winter's cover. Witness accounts were limited, though one passerby recalled seeing Ellen step out of the shop carrying a small paper bag of developed prints, her breath visible in the air as she hurried across the intersection. That was the final confirmed sighting. While television stations filled broadcasts with holiday features and travel forecasts, the case grew steadily colder through December. Flyers bearing Ellen's photograph were taped to storefront windows, stapled to telephone poles, and placed near bus depots. The Eisenhower-era homes around her neighborhood displayed wreaths and lights, creating an uneasy contrast between seasonal cheer and the quiet absence that settled over the Kramer household. Detectives reviewed transit records, expanding the search into outlying suburbs, but the snowfall that followed her disappearance had effectively erased the environmental clues that might have offered direction. When Christmas passed without progress, investigative efforts shifted into long-term mode. The camera shop's logs revealed nothing unusual. The employees remembered no tense interactions, no suspicious customers lingering near closing time. The bag of prints she carried home was never recovered. Analysts began considering the possibility that the missing Thanksgiving photograph, developed during one of the busiest seasons for photo labs, might not have been misplaced accidentally, but intentionally removed at some point between the holiday gathering and the night Ellen walked out of the shop for the last time. By January, New snowfall layered Denver's streets in a muted blanket of white that seemed to swallow the case entirely. Detectives filed supplemental reports, summarizing dozens of fruitless leads. The city moved into the new year, but among older residents, the ones who had lived through decades of Colorado winters, there remained a sense of unfinished business, a suspicion that the land and season had hidden something that would eventually emerge when the cold loosened its hold. In February, the Kramer family allowed local newspapers to run a longer feature about Ellen's disappearance. It described her academic interests, her plans to apply for photography internships in the spring, and her role as the unofficial archivist of family history. The article also mentioned the odd detail about the missing Thanksgiving photograph. A reporter noted that the absence felt symbolic to Ellen's relatives, a small but unsettling reminder that moments meant to be preserved could be quietly removed without explanation. That comment caught the attention of investigators, who had already flagged the missing image as an anomaly. Every confirmed detail mattered in a case where almost nothing concrete remained. When spring arrived, melting snow exposed long-stilled landscapes around the outskirts of the city. Search teams re-examined drainage areas, alleyways, and open fields that had been previously obscured. Volunteer groups combed through brush and thawing creek beds, but no sign of Ellen or her belongings surfaced. The camera bag she often carried, her winter coat, and the paper envelope with customers' prints remained unaccounted for. Each absence added to the growing profile of a case shaped more by what was missing than by what was known. By summer, Denver entered a season of festivals, long daylight hours, and heavy traffic from vacationers traveling through the Rockies. The Kramer case faded from the front pages, though detectives continued periodic reviews. One officer, assigned to organize the growing file, noted the unusual consistency of the family albums that Ellen managed. Page after page reflected the same deliberate order and structure. Holidays, birthdays, annual trips, every year built upon the last with almost architectural precision. The missing photograph interrupted that continuity, raising questions about whether someone had removed it during Thanksgiving, whether it had been lost afterward, or whether its disappearance connected to the night Ellen herself vanished. Thanksgiving approached again before investigators uncovered anything new. The case entered its 11th month, and the family braced for a holiday defined by absence. Snow returned to Denver, collecting on rooftops, tree branches, and the wide streets leading toward Cherry Creek and the foothills. The cold sharpened the city's edges, and memories of the previous December resurfaced in the public consciousness. The camera shop where Ellen had worked placed a small framed photograph of her near the register, as a reminder that unresolved stories lingered in the background of holiday routines. On December 12, almost exactly 1 year after Ellen was last seen, a maintenance worker inspecting a cluttered storage shed behind a row of older duplexes in Inglewood found a small bundle wedged between loosened floorboards. It contained several items wrapped in deteriorating fabric, a broken wristwatch, 2 blank film canisters, and a fragment of a photograph that had faded around the edges. The fragment showed part of a table setting, a plate, a sprig of pine, and what appeared to be a section of a patterned sweater sleeve. Investigators recognized it as consistent with the Thanksgiving photo the Kramer family had described. This partial recovery shifted the investigation into active mode once again. Detectives mapped the location of the shed relative to bus routes and residential clusters from the 1970s. The structure had belonged to a property owner who frequently rented to short-term tenants, many of whom had since relocated across the state. Records were incomplete, but the timeline suggested that one particular tenant had occupied the adjacent duplex for several months during the winter of Ellen's disappearance. That individual had once been flagged during the initial canvassing because he lived near the bus line Ellen used, but no evidence tied him directly to the case. At the time, he was dismissed as an unrelated neighbor. Now, however, the appearance of a Thanksgiving photograph fragment inside a shed once connected to his residence elevated the significance of that earlier contact. Investigators began tracking his employment history, residential changes, and any possible connection to the camera shop. They learned he had developed film regularly during the 1970s, often using small independent photo labs like the one where Ellen worked. He had moved away from Colorado in 1982, leaving behind minimal documentation and no known friends in the area. His departure had been abrupt but not criminally suspicious. The more investigators reviewed the cases from that period, the more they noticed recurring overlaps between the man's movements and locations where small personal items had been reported lost by various residents, including gloves, keys, and photographs. Nothing illegal was ever established, but a pattern of proximity emerged. Detectives revisited witness notes from 1977, including a brief mention of a customer who appeared at the camera shop days before Ellen vanished, requesting quick reprints and asking unusual questions about processing times. That customer had never been identified. Now, with the fragment found in Inglewood, investigators began re-examining the paper trails left behind. The Denver Police Department consulted state archives, Social Security records, and forwarding addresses to determine the man's location. They eventually found he had settled in rural Nebraska, working seasonal jobs and living in a small rented home near a grain elevator. Plans were made to initiate a background interview, but the priority remained evidence, not speculation. Before moving forward, detectives wanted a stronger physical link between the shed discovery and the missing woman. This renewed scrutiny set the stage for developments that, after nearly a year of silence, would alter the trajectory of the case once again. The discovery inside the Inglewood shed was cataloged, photographed, and analyzed with the caution reserved for artifacts that might serve as the only surviving bridge between a vanished person and the final hours before she disappeared. The fragment of the Thanksgiving photograph, though small, carried subtle details that investigators considered invaluable. The texture of the tablecloth, the faint outline of a cup, and the partial presence of someone seated near Ellen's usual place at holiday gatherings. The family confirmed the authenticity of the print fragment, noting that the pattern of the sweater sleeve belonged to a distant relative who had attended that year's Thanksgiving dinner. This detail, while not directly incriminating, verified that the photograph had indeed been removed from the album and relocated to the shed at some point after the holiday. The question of who moved it and why became the dominant line of inquiry. Throughout early December, the case file expanded with new interviews, record requests, and forensic consultations. Specialists examined the shed structure itself, documenting how drafts and moisture might have affected any items stored inside. They determined the fabric-wrapped bundle had been undisturbed for years, its placement indicating intentional concealment rather than accidental loss. The degraded fibers suggested exposure to fluctuating temperatures consistent with long-term abandonment. Soil samples taken from beneath the floorboards displayed imprints that might indicate prior tampering around the time period investigators were most interested in. Even slight shifts in sediment supported the theory that someone had deliberately stored the objects. With this new momentum, detectives pursued the former Inglewood tenant, the man who had occupied the duplex during the winter of 1977, more aggressively. They assembled a chronological map of his movements, drawing from leasing records, employment logs, and archived utility statements. The tenant, identified as Harold Peterson, had arrived in Colorado in mid-1976 and worked a series of short-term jobs. His employment history included janitorial work, warehouse stocking, and a brief stint at a mailroom facility where he was reportedly quiet, punctual, and largely isolated from coworkers. The absence of close acquaintances made reconstructing his habits challenging, but financial records showed consistent use of a nearby photo processing shop, reinforcing the earlier suspicion that he frequented spaces similar to where Ellen worked. Detectives also noted that Peterson had lived less than 3 blocks from the bus stop Ellen would have used on the night she disappeared. At the time, investigators had lacked any physical evidence tying him to the timeline. Now, the presence of the Thanksgiving photograph fragment in a shed connected to his former residence introduced a compelling thread worth pursuing. By mid-December, Denver police contacted Nebraska authorities, requesting assistance in arranging a voluntary interview. The winter landscape of rural Nebraska mirrored the cold scene back in Colorado, flat expanses dusted with snow, wind pressing against the walls of modest homes, and the subdued pace that often accompanied the post-harvest season. When detectives arrived at Peterson's residence, they found a quiet property lined with aging trees and a narrow driveway partially covered in frost. The initial contact was uneventful. Peterson, now older, appeared cooperative but distant. He denied any knowledge of Ellen or her disappearance. He claimed he had never interacted with her, never visited the camera shop where she worked, and had no explanation for why part of her family photograph would surface inside a property he once occupied. His responses were careful, but investigators noted gaps in his recollections. He repeated that he lived alone during his Colorado years, rarely socialized, and spent holidays by himself. When asked whether he had ever picked up photographs from local shops, he acknowledged that he used photo developers frequently, explaining that he photographed buildings, mechanical parts, and abandoned structures as a hobby. Yet he could not recall whether he had visited the specific shop where Ellen had worked. His inability to provide concrete answers neither implicated nor cleared him. After the interview, detectives left Nebraska with a renewed sense of urgency. The evidence remained circumstantial, but the alignment of location, habits, and opportunity heightened the need for deeper forensic investigation. They returned to Denver with soil samples, wood fragments from the shed, and the items recovered from beneath the floorboards. The forensic unit began testing the photograph fragment for fingerprints or trace materials. While degradation complicated the process, analysts found faint impressions on the fabric bundle that were potentially suitable for comparison. They also examined the blank film canisters found with the photograph, hoping they might contain latent prints or residue. As December progressed, the holidays once again draped Denver in familiar seasonal imagery: tree lots, wreaths on doors, and window displays illuminated against early nights. The Kramer household faced its second Christmas without answers. Their decorations were minimal this time, symbolic gestures rather than celebrations. Investigators remained mindful that the emotional weight of the season often surfaced in the details of cold cases, bringing renewed pressure to produce answers. In January, forensic analysts made a modest but significant breakthrough. The faint impressions on one of the film canisters produced partial fingerprints suitable for comparison. When run through updated databases, one of the prints returned a preliminary match to Harold Peterson, dating back to an old employment file. The print was not definitive evidence of a crime. He could have owned the canister legitimately, but its presence among items linked to the missing woman provided investigators with a stronger basis for re-evaluating his involvement. Detectives expanded their search into archival records, contacting former landlords, employers, and neighbors from Peterson's years in Colorado. Interviews revealed a man who kept to himself, maintained irregular working hours, and occasionally stored miscellaneous items in the shed behind the Inglewood duplex. A former neighbor recalled seeing him bring objects wrapped in cloth into the shed during winter months, though she could not remember specific dates. Her recollection reinforced the idea that Peterson used the shed regularly, increasing the likelihood that the Thanksgiving photograph fragment had been placed there by him or someone closely connected to him. With this new information, investigators turned their attention to reconstructing Ellen's final movements in greater detail. They revisited the camera shop records, identifying every customer who had picked up prints in the days leading up to her disappearance. Old receipts and handwritten notes from 1977 were examined under magnification, revealing purchase codes, timestamps, and occasional employee initials. The margin notes often used by staff to track rush orders suggested that a customer matching Peterson's general description might have visited the shop on December 12, a date consistent with the timeline leading to Ellen's disappearance. While handwriting analysis could not confirm whether Ellen had written the note, it suggested she had processed the order. Investigators also looked into the content of the missing Thanksgiving photograph itself. According to the family, the image depicted Ellen seated near the head of the table, her hands resting on a folded napkin, the surrounding setting decorated with simple autumn colors. Examining photographs adjacent to the missing one in the album, detectives noted that Ellen was wearing a distinctive bracelet that appeared in many holiday images. The bracelet was never recovered among her belongings, adding another unresolved detail to the case. Forensic consultants speculated that if someone had removed the photograph, they might also have taken the bracelet, either as a keepsake or an attempt to eliminate personal traces. By early spring, the investigation reached a point where detectives needed new direction. They contacted a criminal behavior analyst to examine the patterns emerging from the evidence. The analyst proposed a scenario rooted in opportunity rather than premeditation. Someone familiar with photo processing environments might have taken particular interest in Ellen's work, noticing her routine and schedule. The missing photograph in this view represented not a calculated message, but an impulsive act, one that later compelled the person to hide related items in a location they believed would remain undisturbed. This hypothesis increased scrutiny on Peterson's relationship with photography. Investigators obtained old film development records from multiple shops in the Denver metropolitan area. Although many had incomplete archives, enough remained to establish that Peterson frequently submitted batches of mundane photographs, mostly buildings, objects, and empty spaces. Analysts assessing his patterns noted that none of his prints included people, suggesting an unusual avoidance that aligned with behaviors sometimes observed in individuals uncomfortable with social environments. Meanwhile, Denver entered another summer. More than a year and a half had passed since Ellen's disappearance. The city's pace quickened with warm weather, festivals, and crowds on sidewalks, but the case remained a subdued presence inside the police department's cold case office. Files from the 1970s were stored alongside aging binders, maps, and crime scene photographs whose edges had begun to curl. Even so, investigators refused to let the case recede. They repeatedly returned to the Inglewood shed, analyzing it from every possible angle. In late July, during another detailed search of the shed's surrounding grounds, a detective noticed a slight depression in the soil near the building's rear corner. The ground, though hardened over the years, bore signs of disturbance inconsistent with natural erosion. Excavation revealed fragments of deteriorated plastic, the remnants of what appeared to be a camera bag. Inside the fragments were corroded metal pieces consistent with the buckles used on bags from the late 1970s. Testing would be required to determine whether the bag had any direct connection to Ellen, but the proximity to the previously recovered items significantly raised the likelihood. This discovery prompted forensic teams to take additional soil samples for trace analysis. The results were not immediate, but labs reported early indications of fabric particles resembling wool, possibly from a winter coat. The idea that Ellen's belongings might have been concealed near the shed, rather than scattered elsewhere, gained increased plausibility. Investigators began preparing for broader excavation of the surrounding lot. Near the end of summer, forensic analysts provided a more detailed report on the items found within the shed. The Thanksgiving photograph fragment showed faint smudges consistent with skin oils, although degradation prevented precise attribution. The fabric wrapping, however, contained several trace fibers that matched carpet samples used in the Inglewood duplex during the 1970s. This placed the bundle inside the residence at some point, strengthening the connection to its former occupant. As autumn approached and Denver once again moved toward another holiday season, investigators grew increasingly confident that they were closing in on a crucial link, one that would eventually bring long-awaited clarity to the Kramer family. As October settled over Denver, the cold case team intensified preparations for a controlled excavation of the Inglewood property. The shed and its adjoining lot had already yielded a fragment of the missing Thanksgiving photograph, blank film canisters, and remnants of what might have been a camera bag. Now investigators believed there was reasonable cause to conduct a more invasive search for additional evidence. The landowner, informed of the historical significance of the investigation, granted formal permission, and forensic archaeologists were brought in to oversee the process. Their presence was essential. The property had undergone multiple winters, soil shifts, and structural adjustments over nearly 2 decades, meaning any potential artifacts would need to be extracted with methodological precision to preserve context. On a cold morning tinged with the early bite of fall, ground-penetrating radar was deployed across the lot. The equipment traced patterns beneath the soil, shallow depressions, disturbed layers, and compacted segments possibly shaped by past human activity. Analysts highlighted 2 anomalies worth exploring: a narrow, elongated signature near the back fence line and a deeper, irregular shape closer to the shed's foundation. Neither pattern guaranteed evidence connected to the Kramer case, but both warranted careful excavation. Throughout the following week, teams worked in controlled grids, brushing aside layers of soil and documenting each shift. The elongated anomaly near the fence revealed nothing more than remnants of an old drainage pipe, but the irregular signature near the shed proved more compelling. Beneath 18 inches of compacted earth, investigators uncovered fragments of a deteriorated scarf, a plastic button from a type of winter coat popular in the late 1970s, and small metallic pieces that appeared to belong to a camera lens cap. Although none of these items could be immediately tied to Ellen, the growing cluster of objects, each consistent with the time frame of her disappearance, created a mounting sense of proximity to long-hidden truth. One early afternoon, as the team carefully sifted through the soil adjacent to the scarf fragments, a forensic technician uncovered a thin, rectangular object coated in hardened dirt. The object, once cleaned, was identified as a heavily weathered wallet. Its contents were degraded, the leather warped beyond recognition. Inside, however, investigators found shreds of paper, remnants of laminated material, and the faint outline of a photograph that had fused to the wallet's interior lining. Specialists transported the item to the lab for dehumidification and restoration. The restoration process lasted days. Layer by layer, conservators teased apart the materials, revealing a partial Colorado Transit pass issued in 1977, faded ink markings, and what appeared to be remnants of a student ID photograph. The possibility that the wallet belonged to Ellen raised immediate questions. The Kramer family, summoned to review the partially preserved items, studied the recovered pieces with quiet steadiness. They recognized the arrangement of the transit pass, the placement of folded papers, and the faint silhouette of the photograph. Although the image was too damaged for forensic comparison, the family believed the wallet was hers. This belief, while not legally conclusive, unified investigators around a stark realization. Ellen's belongings had almost certainly been concealed on the property connected to Harold Peterson. Armed with this evidence, Denver police and prosecutors convened to determine next steps. The recovered items remained circumstantial in isolation, but collectively they formed a narrative of proximity, opportunity, and concealment. Moreover, the fingerprint found on the film canister, while partial, provided a verifiable physical link between Peterson and objects hidden alongside what appeared to be Ellen's possessions. Investigators prepared a formal application for a search warrant targeting Peterson's Nebraska residence, specifically any storage areas, closed containers, or personal effects that might hold additional photographic materials, documents, or items tied to the 1977 disappearance. The warrant was approved in late October. Nebraska law enforcement officers coordinated with Denver detectives to execute the search. When authorities entered Peterson's modest home, they found a sparse interior marked by orderly arrangements, neatly stacked boxes, labeled plastic bins, and shelves lined with old manuals and tools. Nothing overtly suspicious lay in plain view. But in the back room, inside a metal cabinet secured by a rusted latch, investigators discovered several envelopes containing undeveloped film negatives dating back decades. Although many had deteriorated, some remained intact enough for processing. The negatives were transported to a forensic imaging lab. Technicians used specialized equipment to extract what remained of the images. The results were largely mundane: abandoned buildings, empty lots, mechanical parts. But among the final set, analysts identified a frame featuring the edge of a tablecloth, strikingly similar to the one in the recovered Thanksgiving photograph fragment. Though incomplete, the angle suggested the photographer had been positioned behind or beside the person, wearing the patterned sweater sleeve seen in the Kramer family's images. None of the developed negatives showed Ellen herself, but the presence of a parallel vantage point raised critical questions about why Peterson had captured, or attempted to capture, imagery associated with the Kramer Thanksgiving gathering. Investigators consulted photography experts, who explained that film negatives from that era were often reused or repurposed if someone dismantled and reloaded existing rolls. Inconsistencies in numbering and film type supported the theory that Peterson might have collected discarded negatives or removed film from various sources. If he had indeed come into possession of the Thanksgiving photograph, it was plausible that other related images, whether intentionally taken or accidentally acquired, might still exist somewhere among his belongings. Meanwhile, Denver's winter approached once again. As the holiday season returned, the case neared its second full year in active reinvestigation. Neighborhoods filled with lights, store windows displayed wreaths, and seasonal music echoed through the city. Yet for detectives, the season served only as a somber reminder of how the case had begun. The timeline, the snow, the family gathering, and the missing photograph all converged into a symbol of disruption that had endured across holidays and seasons. At the forensic lab, analysts continued enhancing the recovered negatives, isolating shapes, shadows, and table arrangements visible in the degraded frames. One particular detail stood out: a faint reflection in a glass ornament positioned on the table. Although unclear, the shape resembled a figure leaning inward, possibly holding a camera. While the image lacked the clarity required for identification, its orientation supported the growing assumption that the photographer had been physically present during, or shortly, after the Kramer Thanksgiving gathering in 1977. Investigators compared this possibility against the known facts. Peterson had no known ties to the Kramer family. Records showed he had lived alone, held temporary jobs, and rarely interacted socially. It was unlikely he had been invited to a private family gathering. Therefore, if he had gained access to the scene, or to the film from that day, such access was unlikely to have been sanctioned. The implications were difficult but unavoidable. The integration of the photograph fragment, the wallet, the camera bag remnants, and the undeveloped negatives collectively pointed toward a chain of actions originating with Peterson. Based on this convergence of evidence, prosecutors assembled a timeline reconstruction for review by the Colorado District Attorney. It detailed Ellen's final shift, the timing of her disappearance, Peterson's proximity to her bus route, his known visits to photo processing shops, and the concealment of objects linked to her in the shed. The reconstruction also included statements from former neighbors who recalled him storing items wrapped in fabric during the winter months. Although the evidence remained circumstantial, its cumulative weight compelled prosecutors to authorize a formal charge of first-degree murder, supported by concealment of evidence and obstruction of an investigation. On a clear but cold December morning, law enforcement officers arrived once again at Peterson's Nebraska residence. This time they carried an arrest warrant. Peterson, now older and noticeably fatigued, offered no resistance. He was transported to Colorado under escort, processed, and held pending trial. Throughout pre-trial interviews, he maintained his innocence, offering no explanations for the items found in the shed or the wallet recovered near its foundation. His demeanor remained detached, offering little insight into his history or motivations. During trial proceedings, forensic experts outlined the material connections: the fingerprint match on the film canister, the fiber correlations between the shed materials and the original duplex, the recovered fragments of Ellen's belongings, and the undeveloped negatives showing imagery tied to her family's Thanksgiving table. While no direct eyewitness testimony existed, the prosecution emphasized the totality of evidence and the improbability of alternative explanations. The defense argued degenerative memory, misattributed artifacts, and circumstantial inference. They contended that the shed had been used by multiple tenants, and that items could have been deposited long after Peterson vacated the property. But analysts demonstrated degradation timelines for the wallet and fabric fragments that aligned specifically with the late 1970s era. Photographic experts confirmed that the negative showing the table arrangement was consistent with film stock manufactured and sold during the months surrounding Ellen's disappearance. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. Their decision, delivered on a quiet winter afternoon, found Peterson guilty on all charges. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Peterson offered no final statement during sentencing, leaving the courtroom with the same distant expression he had maintained since his arrest. For the Kramer family, the verdict brought a measure of closure. Though the full truth of Ellen's final hours remained beyond reach, the resolution provided structure where uncertainty had once ruled. They held a small memorial gathering that winter, placing restored photographs, those she had organized, those she had cherished, across their living room table. One empty space remained where the missing Thanksgiving photograph would have gone, preserved now only through fragments and memory. In Denver, the case file was closed, its final pages documenting a multi-year effort that spanned seasons, jurisdictions, and evolving forensic technologies. The shed behind the Inglewood duplex was eventually dismantled, its contents cataloged and archived. Snow fell again that December, covering the land where long-hidden evidence had once rested. The city moved forward into another holiday season, carrying with it the quiet weight of a case solved not through spectacle, but through persistence, detail, and the steady passage of time. The trial's conclusion marked a turning point not only for the Kramer family, but also for the investigators who had carried the burden of the case through decades of shifting procedures, staffing changes, and evolving forensic techniques. Closing a file that had remained open for so many years required thoughtful review, detailed archival documentation, and a final synthesis of each discovery that had led from a missing family photograph to a courtroom verdict. For many within the department, the resolution stood as a reminder that even cases born in seasons of silence could one day re-emerge with clarity. Once Peterson was transferred into the state correctional system, prosecutors conducted a public briefing summarizing the chronology of the case. The briefing acknowledged the limitations inherent in cold case investigations, particularly those dependent on fragile material evidence stored across decades. Journalists covered the hearing with measured attention, noting the unusual nature of a solved disappearance with roots anchored so deeply in a single photograph. Yet the media coverage remained reserved, reflecting the sober tone of the investigation itself. No sensational headlines accompanied the case. Instead, local newspapers presented the facts methodically, emphasizing the persistence of investigators and the patience of a family waiting for answers. As winter settled across Denver once again, the Kramer family moved through the season with a quieter rhythm than years prior. The verdict had brought structure and resolution, but it did not erase memory or loss. Their home, which had once displayed rows of carefully organized albums curated by Ellen herself, now featured a small shelf dedicated to her legacy. It held restored photographs from family gatherings, childhood milestones, and holiday seasons that had preceded the disappearance. A few images, carefully selected, were enlarged and framed, small anchors that preserved the life she lived rather than the circumstances of her final night. Investigators who had worked the case for substantial portions of their careers reflected on its trajectory. The discovery of the photograph fragment in the Inglewood shed had provided an unexpected thread after years without movement. That single piece of cardboard, partly protected by fabric and partly eroded by time, had carried the weight of an entire missing person investigation. It served as a striking reminder of the delicate interplay between physical evidence and the environmental forces that either preserve or erase it. The Inglewood property itself underwent changes in the months following the conclusion of the trial. The lot behind the duplex, once cluttered with the aging shed, was cleared and leveled. New tenants eventually moved into the building, unaware of the role the land had played in uncovering long-hidden truth. City-permitting records showed that the property owner planned modest landscaping improvements, nothing elaborate, just enough to maintain the space. Life around the area continued unaffected, with residential traffic, seasonal routines, and the faint hum of daily living echoing through the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Denver's cold case unit reviewed the investigative steps that had ultimately led to the solution. They noted the importance of maintaining thorough archives, preserving fragile material evidence, and reevaluating leads in response to emerging technologies. The fingerprint match on the film canister, a sliver of physical connection, had been nearly impossible to detect using the tools available in the late 1970s. It was only through modern imaging and updated national databases that the partial print could be matched to Peterson. Similarly, the restoration of the damaged wallet had depended on advancements in forensic conservation techniques that did not exist when the investigation first began. Forensic anthropologists and behavior analysts contributed post-case evaluations, emphasizing that the circumstances surrounding Ellen's disappearance fit the profile of a spontaneous opportunistic crime rather than a premeditated act. Peterson's solitary lifestyle, pattern of collecting misplaced objects, and proximity to Ellen's route had aligned to create a scenario that investigators had struggled to understand for decades in the absence of direct witnesses. The concealment of personal items beneath the shed floorboards reflected an impulsive effort to hide objects rather than a sophisticated attempt to obscure forensic evidence. These conclusions, while not diminishing the gravity of the crime, offered some explanation for why the case had remained unresolved for so long. During the spring following the trial, the Kramer family received the personal effects recovered from the Inglewood property that had been confirmed as Ellen's. They chose to preserve them privately, treating each piece not as an artifact of tragedy but as part of her history. The wallet, though fragile, was placed within a protective case. The deteriorated scarf fragments were sealed in archival storage. The camera bag remnants, though unrecognizable in form, were displayed for a brief period as part of a private memorial before being stored away. For the family, the physical items represented the final chapters of a story they had spent decades hoping to understand. Across Denver, the changing seasons continued to mark the passage of time. Spring brought wind through the streets, melting the last patches of winter frost. Summer arrived with long daylight hours and festivals in the city's public spaces. Yet for those who had followed the Kramer case closely, the memory of its winter origins lingered. It remained a story rooted in the December quiet of 1977, shaped by snowfall, holiday routines, and a missing photograph that had once seemed to vanish into the cold. Several investigators from the cold case unit continued to visit the Kramer family periodically in the months following the verdict. These visits, though unofficial, reflected the human dimension of the work. One detective described how the case had influenced his approach to subsequent investigations, emphasizing the importance of patience, incremental progress, and attentiveness to overlooked details. Another noted that the case underscored the value of re-interviewing individuals who had once seemed peripheral. The neighbor who recalled Peterson carrying items wrapped in cloth during the winter months had not offered critical testimony at the time, yet her memory contributed significantly to reconstructing the timeline decades later. Outside Colorado, the case also prompted other jurisdictions to re-examine long-dormant files involving missing persons from the late 1970s and early 1980s. The Nebraska State Police reviewed their records for any overlapping details, but found no indication that Peterson had been linked to other incidents. His life, according to employment files and residential histories, had remained largely transient but solitary. The absence of additional cases did not diminish the severity of his actions in Denver, but it provided some measure of assurance that Ellen's disappearance had not formed part of a broader pattern. As the months stretched into a full year after the trial, Denver's cold case unit finalized its comprehensive report. The document, spanning multiple binders, included recovered photographs, lab analyses, soil composition studies, negative enhancements, and detailed excavation diagrams. It also contained personal notes from lead investigators, reflecting on the evolution of forensic methodologies over the decades. The report was archived in the Municipal Records Building, stored alongside countless other case files, each representing a chapter in the city's legal history. In the Kramer household, life moved forward with a quiet dignity. The family continued their traditions in modified form, embracing holiday gatherings with renewed intention. Their Thanksgiving table included an unbroken sequence of photographs from past years, restored images capturing joy, connection, and the passage of time. The missing Thanksgiving photograph from 1977 remained absent from the album, but its fragment, preserved under museum-grade glass, existed as both a symbol of loss and a testament to persistence. On Christmas Eve 1 year after the verdict, the family attended a candlelight service at a small church not far from their home. The ceremony was modest, the congregation familiar, the atmosphere calm. Afterward, as they stepped into the cold December air, snow began to fall lightly, accumulating on the streets and rooftops in the same quiet manner that had defined the winter Ellen disappeared. The moment carried no dramatic symbolism, only a sense of peace, a recognition that closure had arrived through effort, time, and a community unwilling to let the case fade. In the broader community, the story of the solved cold case took on a reflective tone. It served as a reminder that even the smallest details, a misplaced negative, a weathered wallet, a torn fragment of a photograph, could hold the key to long-sought answers. It underscored that justice, while sometimes delayed, could emerge through persistence and the slow but determined progress of investigative work. Denver continued to grow and change around the legacy of the case. New developments rose along major corridors, public spaces expanded, and neighborhoods evolved. Yet in archives, old records remained preserved in climate-controlled rooms, awaiting future examination by those who might look for stories hidden in the past. Among them was the Kramer file, complete now, its final pages detailing the resolution that had once seemed unreachable. Years later, the story would occasionally surface in discussions among investigators, forensic students, and archivists. It was not remembered for sensational elements or dramatic confrontations, but for its steady, methodical unraveling. It was remembered for the way winter landscapes could conceal answers and how patient work could reveal them. The quiet aftermath reflected the nature of the case itself, solemn, measured, meaningful not for spectacle but for its conclusion. The family found a way to integrate the loss into their lives without allowing it to define them. Investigators carried the lessons into future cases, and the city, shaped by countless stories both public and private, absorbed one more chapter into its history. In the end, the missing photo from the family album became more than a lost memory. It became the fragment that bridged decades, the piece that turned silence into understanding, and the clue that allowed a long-buried truth to surface from the cold December ground where it had been waiting.